Hi everyone. Gunachchish, Hati Adi. Thanks for coming. Ishmael was saying yesterday in his remarks that he wanted someone to say something in a Slavic language, so I'm also going to say, Jestem bardzo wdzięczny, że Państwo tutaj przyszli. I'm so grateful that you have come, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Matthew Spellberg. I work on the East Coast. I'm from Boston. I'm always thrilled, though, to be a guest here on Tlingit Ani. Quant Lane, in her lovely talk today, was talking about how she felt like she was in a movie every time she goes to Washington, D.C. I sort of feel the same way about Juneau. I come here and I think, I can't believe I'm here. One of the things that I do for a living is I teach literature to college students, and I teach a lot of European literature, but a few years ago I started also teaching native oral literature of the Northwest, especially Haida and Tlingit literature. I fell in love with it. I was amazed by its power. I was amazed by the huge horizons of knowledge and history and culture and emotional expression and beauty that it opened up for me. And I wanted to bring my love for those traditions back to students on the East Coast. And I discovered that this was very tricky because those traditions are very deeply rooted in a place and a people, this place and the people who've lived here for many millennia. And if you're talking about them far away, and if you're like me, a student of these traditions, but by no means a master of them, then there is a real risk of misrepresenting them, of misunderstanding them, of lacking key context, and indeed of presenting material that seems so difficult or hard to wrap your mind around if you're not in the world that it came from, that the students risk feeling alienated. On the other hand, I was so inspired by the example of Richard and Nora Dauenhauer, and particularly the kinds of comments that they often make in their books, like that Tlingit oral literature is for those who wish to know who they are, whoever they are, and who the Tlingit people are. Only through stories and traditions, this is Richard and Nora Dauenhauer, only through stories and traditions like these do we begin to learn who we are, no matter who we are. And I took this to mean that Tlingit and Haida oral literature, like all the world's great traditions, had something to say to every human being who was willing and able to listen. And there are students on the East Coast and everywhere who are willing and eager to listen. And so the question is, for me, and what I've come to this conference to talk about, is how exactly do you make these stories legible, understandable, interpretable, experienceable to people who themselves have not grown up Tlingit, who've not grown up Haida, but who can stand to benefit from the kind of lessons, the kind of images, the kinds of forms of beauty and excitement that these stories promise and offer. So what I'm going to do today is lay out a very schematic possible roadmap for introducing a masterpiece of Tlingit oral literature to students who have open minds but who don't particularly know anything about the Northwest Coast, about Tlingit Ani, about Tlingit Kursiyi, even about oral literature. I myself have been reading these texts for a few years, but I'm still a very new student of the language and the culture, and I still have a great deal to learn myself, and I want to give a shout out to my teachers in Juneau, Ishmael Hope, Will Geiger, and the Tlingit Language Learners Group, who some of you just saw up here giving a panel. They are really amazing, and they just welcomed me into their Zoom group and their In the Flesh language learning groups this summer, and it was like a coming home for me. It was just amazing. So, Gunachchish to you all. You guys all get the credit for anything that is good about this presentation, and you get no blame for the errors or mistakes. So what I want to do is just talk through a story and ways in which I might get people to think about a story, how it fits together, how it works, what its meanings might be, and solicit your feedback. Many of you in this room are experts far beyond me, and I want to involve you all in a conversation about how best we might understand a beautiful, excellent, complex, difficult story from the Tlingit oral literary tradition. So when I think about a story in general, an oral story, I ask myself a couple of very simple questions, and I ask my students these questions too. You might say that they're deceptively simple questions because they can build up many, many, many layers of response. And they're these four questions here. One, how do the different parts of the story fit together? Two, what emotional and intellectual effects arise from the form of the story, from the way it's told? And another way of framing this very important question is, how does the language of the story build a world in the mind? So how do you go from language to image, imagination, a whole reality that you're picturing? Three, what other stories can help us to think about this one? And four, what messages or meanings does this story have for us? And I want to say that it's really important that I always ask myself that question, number 4, last, and that I try to work through the other 3 questions first, because I think that if we don't build for ourselves a picture of a story in our minds and try really hard to generate a whole world that comes out of a story, then when we try to jump to an interpretation and say, what's the lesson of this story, or what is this story trying to say or teach us, we risk being superficial with our interpretations. We risk jumping too quickly into the question of, like, what does it mean, if we can't first picture what is being described? What's the world that the author wants us to step into? Because the meaning is going to be in that world and not just in the language on the surface. So I'd like you to keep these 4 simple questions in mind as I talk now about a story that I think many of you know. It's a story by Robert Zuboff, the great storyteller, Shada of the KTOO, child of the Dakhwedi. I'm going to talk about his telling of Mosquito, Tak'a. I hope many of you love this story as much as I do. It's one of the first stories in the Dauenhauer's Hashuka collection. And if we had a little more time, I'd play you the 7-minute record of Shadach telling the story. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to summarize the story. I'm going to try to point out some important passages. And then I'm going to try to work through a little bit of those 4 questions. And if you have a comment, if you feel inspired to add something, please raise your hand and let's talk about it. So Shadach starts his story by describing a scene on his boat. And his boat is called Guide, when he was a young man. And he starts like this, it was in this boat of mine, it was called Guide, I would travel around in it, seining. In Tlingit, he says, away ach jagu yikt, Guide you do sagen, I yikt away at nacha kucht as geu. My name in Tlingit is Shadach. It was because of my name Gitwain called me over. So he's saying, okay, I'm sailing on this boat, and one day someone older, Gitwain, comes over to me and says, I came over to you because of your name, Shadach. And then Shadach kind of changes the subject, and he has this little aside where he says, I loved this boat so much. It was a 1906 model, and I had 2 of them. And he goes on to say, I gave the second one to my son to use, and my son, he wrecked it. And he breaks out of Tlingit into English, and he says he wrecked the boat in English. And then, very quickly, Shadach jumps back to this scene between him and this elder Gitwain, and he says, Gitwain told him, I'd like very much to explain your name to you. And then the story jumps into what you might call the main part of the story. And there's 2 possibilities here in terms of imagining what's going on in your mind. One possibility is that the whole rest of the story is a continuation of this quote, that now we get a story within a story where Gitwain is narrating, Shadach is narrating through his own mouth what Gitwain told him, and now we have like a flashback and Gitwain is telling this story. Or perhaps this is Shadach now doing a paraphrase of what Gitwain told him, and we're supposed to jump into the world of this main part of the story. And that main part of the story goes something like this. Long ago, the people were living in the interior, not on the coast, and their lives were very hard. And they were dependent on the salmon runs, and they loved the salmon runs, but otherwise food was scarce, and it was so scarce that sometimes people ate each other. There was a family, and the older sons went out one by one to get food, and they didn't come back. And finally, the youngest son, and Shadach is very specific here, he says he must have been 17 or 18 years old, this youngest son. He meets a cannibal. He's so frightened he can't move. The cannibal hits him on the head, throws him in a sack, takes him to his house, and leaves the bag just outside the door. Then the boy regains consciousness. He gets a hold of a club, and when the cannibal sticks his head out the door, he clubs him to death. And the cannibal then is dead, right? But then he gets so mad that he says, I know I killed this cannibal, but it did a painful thing to me. It killed 2 of my older brothers. What more can I do to make it feel more pain? Maybe it will be better if I build a fire under him and burn him up. And then Shadach goes on, so just like that, when he built a fire, he pulled him into it. He pulled the cannibal into the fire. When only the ashes were left, when he couldn't make up his mind, he thought, what more can I do to the cannibal's ashes? And while he couldn't make up his mind, he blew on it. He blew on the cannibal's ashes. They went into the air they became mosquitoes. That's why mosquitoes, when they bite someone, hurt you bad. They're still the cannibal even today. And then the story basically comes to an end with some reflections here. The Lord above created this world. He loved us very much. Mosquitoes were created by the world. This is why there is a story about it. When we were living in Teslin, it's beside the big lake, Teslin, the place called Caribou Cross, the place where the animals cross. Right near it is called Teslin. There are many people there. We are many. We are still there. They speak our language. And this is how I'll end it. And now I will tell the stories to the children in English. Okay, so there's much. There's a lot of things going on in this story, but I'm just going to mention a few and try to answer in a preliminary way those 4 questions. So the first thing I want to talk about here is how would I say that the different parts of the story fit together, and how would I try to explain to students how the different parts of the story fit together? Well, you might say that in a big way there's 3 parts to this story. There's the frame, there's the main story, and there's a kind of epilogue. The frame has 2 parts. Gitwain telling the story about his name, so Gitwain calling Shadach over and saying, I got to tell you why you have this name, Shadach. And then also telling a smaller story, Shadach telling this other story about his boats and his son wrecking the boats. The frame tells us a lot. Richard Downhauer wrote about this frame by Shadach in his doctoral dissertation, and he said it was really important because it told us something of the personality of the storyteller and also about his reasons for telling the story, and the fact that it's connected to his name, Shadach, which incidentally means around the mountain, by the mountain, and that what gets this story started is one tradition bearer imparting knowledge to another. But the frame also says something else. It says that this story that happened long ago is also connected to a life being lived in the present. And I think in this respect it's very important that in the frame, Shadach keeps breaking into English, whereas in the story, he's speaking almost entirely in Tlingit. There's maybe one word in English. He says he uses the word family once. But it's as if to say, this story from long ago, this story of when we were in the interior, this is also somehow connected to the life I live now. And what happened to the Tlingit people back then is also related to what happens to them and to others now, including that we live in a different world now. A world of contact with Europeans, a world of sailing boats, 1906 models, all this kind of stuff. So on this boat, in the sea, Shadach learns that his name is Shadach. That is to say, or why his name is Shadach, around the mountain. He comes to learn that it's a name from the interior, from when people were traveling and staying near mountains in the interior. So here's another interesting relationship between the frame and the main story. The main story takes place far in the inland, right? And the name comes from the inland. But the frame takes place on the ocean. There's very little fish in the interior, Shadach says. Life is hard. People have to eat each other. But the story is being told on a fishing boat. He's seining. He's getting tons of fish, right? He's got this big net. So he's setting up a contrast between the life now and the life then. And then he brings up this kind of random detail about his son, right? He says, my son wrecked the boat. Why does he bring that up? How does it relate to the main story? Well, one possibility I'd suggest to you is that in the main story, there's a young boy who's also reckless, right? There's this boy, and Shadach goes out of his way to say, I think he was 17, maybe 18. Where does that detail come from? It's possible that Shadach is setting up, I'm not saying it's certain, but it's possible that Shadach is setting up some parallel between the fact that here's my son who wrecked a boat, and here's this guy who, in some kind of serious way, wrecked the whole world, right? Some guy who threw a corpse onto the fire when he shouldn't have, and mosquitoes now plague us from here on out. Okay, so I'm suggesting that this frame part serves as a kind of echo chamber for the main story, a resonance chamber, and it sets up all kinds of parallels and contrasts between the life of the storyteller and the story itself. So the interior versus the coast, it's a contrast. The two reckless sons, it's a similarity. The name Shadach, this is a kind of point of continuation where this name comes passed down through the clan from this earlier time to the present. Okay, now I'm going to jump to the next question and say, okay, so what emotional and intellectual effects arise from the form of the story? How does language build a world in the mind? Well, one very simple way that language works in this story is that Shadach loves to repeat lines. So he loves, when the boy kills the cannibal, he goes, As it struck his head, he struck it. He struck it again. He struck it again. He struck it again. As to say, he gives us something of the drama of it, this kind of onomatopoeia, you might say, right, where the language mimics the experience in the real world, right, of pounding, 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 because he's getting real mad here, killing this cannibal. He gives us some sense in the Tlingit too. There's a wonderful sort of building up of the scene, like he comes out and his head gets stuck out, and then he hits the head. He hits it. So you have maybe you might say simple ways, but effective ways of giving a sense vividly of the kind of drama being played out. But there are instances of a kind of text painting or illustration of the situation through language that are much more complex than this. So, for example, at the beginning of this main story, when Gitwain says, "I'm going to tell you, Shada, why you have your name," and then Shada launches into this story, he gives this marvelous passage, and it goes like this: "We were living there in the interior. Our life there was so hard. The salmon from the ocean, they would come up for us to eat. The salmon. And these, how good they tasted to us, the salmon. It was very hard to live in the interior." Now, I love this passage because it's built like a mirror. Like if you were doing fancy literary criticism, you might use the term chiasmus, but the idea is here that it's built in such a way that the things that started off get mirrored in the second half of the line. So another example of this that some of you may know, the poet John Keats, he has a famous line, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty." So one side of the line mirrors the other side of the line. Is there a comment here?
Can we go back to the repetition of the struck it hard?
Oh, yeah, sure.
The reason he says that in Tlingit frame of reference is that the repetition, he struck it again, is to add emphasis to how important that piece is. Mm. That's why. And you hear this and see this in a lot of Tlingit literature, Tlingit stories. Repetition.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that tsu ashawachich. Yeah, and you have it, that ashawachich 4 times too. 4 is very often a significant number. It has a kind of whole feeling to it. Yeah, wonderful, thank you. And so in this instance, you also have repetition, right? The salmon. And not just the salmon, but you've got the interior, right? We were living there in the interior. Our life was so hard. And then at the very bottom, you have again, it was very hard to live in the interior. And so you have this very elegant mirroring, which in the Tlingit is even more complex and elegant. So here's what it looks like in Tlingit. You have you dok ka, the interior. Aya ach ye ha wutich, tlach aya wutik ha kusti ak. Yachat ya et kadach ha ke hakch. Sorry, my Tlingit is not very good. Yachat aya tlach dat yach saya yachat kunach yat ik kusti you dok ka. So you have Yudok Ka, the interior. Wutik, it was so hard. Hakusti, for our way of life, for our way of being. Yahat, the salmon. The way that they came up from the ocean to our mouths. The salmon. Again, how good they were for our mouths. Yahat, the salmon. And then Kunach, Yatik. It is so difficult. Again, Kusti, that way of being. Yudak Ka, in the interior. So this pattern is very beautiful to me. The way it's like music, it's like a form of poetry. But I want to suggest maybe it's also telling us something, this mirrored pattern, that maybe there's a kind of rhythm to it that's meant to talk about the rhythm of life in the interior. Life is so hard, but all summer you have these salmon runs that come one after the other, and they bring food, they bring sustenance, they come from the ocean, and then life becomes very hard again after the salmon runs have finished. We're back in the interior, you're back far away from the ocean, you have this difficult life, but you have also this kind of very beautiful and poetic, you might say, calendar of the salmon runs and of the experience of the interior, the way that there's a connection to the ocean, that these salmon come up, and then you move back once again into this time of great difficulty. And also, just a quick note too, that the first wutik is in the perfective, and then the last yatik, here you have an imperfective, so you have the feeling of you're entering into the story, as if you're now fully a part of this narrative and this world. So Shada is using this beautiful passage to try to carry us into the story and to carry us into this imaginary, or not imaginary, to carry us into the world of images that he's trying to convey to us. Now, the third and fourth question I'm going to try to do together. So what other stories can help us to think about this one? And for what messages or meanings does this story have for us? And again, like I said, I think it's very important to come to that fourth question after you've thought about these earlier questions of how does this world get built in our minds so that we can feel emotionally and with the image-making capacities of our brain the world that the story is describing. One other story that we might look at in relation to this story is one told by a man named François Mandeville, who was a Métis storyteller who told a story in Chippewayan about a cannibal who also is destroyed and becomes mosquitoes. But in his story, what happens at the very end is very different. The boy cuts off the cannibal's head, and he throws it into the fire, and he leaves the campsite. And he goes to another campsite, and he lays down to sleep, but he's woken up because something is rolling all over him. And he looks up, and he sees that it's the skull of the cannibal, and it's rolling all over him, and it won't leave him alone. And he keeps leaving, he keeps going away, he keeps running away for a whole year, and the skull keeps following him. And finally, he crushes the skull and shoves it into the fire, and mosquitoes come out. Now, why did I throw in this story? Why do I mention it? Well, because I think it helps us to see what is unique about Shadach's story, or you might say what is unique about the Tlingit story. For Shadach, the reason why the mosquitoes get created is not because the boy killed the cannibal. In fact, he had to kill the cannibal, otherwise he would have died. The reason why mosquitoes get created is because the boy goes overboard. He does more than is needed. He destroys the body and desecrates it even after it's dead. He does more than he needs to do in order to survive, right? He keeps thinking to himself, what more can I do to kill this cannibal? His thoughts run away from him. And this is not the case in the story by François Mandeville. And so the message in that story is going to be quite different. And I want to point, again, this is this key moment in Shadach's story. He pulled the cannibal into the fire when only the ashes were left. When he couldn't make up his mind, he thought, what more can I do to the cannibal's ashes? And while he couldn't make up his mind, he blew on it. He blew on the cannibal's ashes. They went into the air. They became mosquitoes. So now I want to point to this final passage that follows that moment in which the cannibal becomes mosquitoes. The Lord above created this world. He loved us very much, us in this world. Mosquitoes were created by the world. So I think here is the moment where Shadach is beginning to point to us what the message is that he's trying to convey. He says that mosquitoes were not the creation of God. They came about because of the world. And so I might suggest to you, this is just a suggestion, that this story tells us of a kind of fall. Like, for example, other stories that may be familiar to us, like the Garden of Eden, many other important, powerful stories about falls. But here the story is different than the Garden of Eden. We're not talking about being thrown out of a paradise, because life is hard in the interior. But there is a fall because suddenly there is excess in the world. So there's doing more than is necessary. In the interior, life is hard, but this is a world in which people do what they must do in order to live and survive. And here, in this story, there is a sense that suddenly we've lost something that we had, or rather we've come to be tormented by something, by mosquitoes, because someone has done too much, more than he should have. And maybe I'll end by linking this story a little bit to the theme of this conference, which is climate change. This story doesn't say, don't ever do harm, don't ever destroy another being. Sometimes maybe you must. But it does say, don't do more than is needed. Don't do more than what you need. And anything beyond that any excessive action that comes from the thoughts that run away from us, that's dangerous, because actions that overstep their intentions create unintended consequences. So thank you very much. Like I said, this is just a sort of preliminary set of thoughts about this story, and I would be eager to hear any comments or reflections from all of you. Good night, cheese.
One of the things I find in Plinkett stories is confronting the temptation to revenge, so that's the Clannad and the origin of the killer whale. And that's a subject of much literature, but it's found in Plinkett, and you pointed it out here too. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And perhaps also the relationship between revenge and overthinking things, which is to say there are forms of revenge in which, or maybe one thing that happens with revenge is when people start to cogitate on, why and what, and it's not fair, and so on and so forth, and that gives rise suddenly to this impulse of revenge. Yes, David.
When you look at the mosquitoes created by the world, that is what there's a story about it. The thing when we say for us and when we say from the world, we're talking about putting the human spirit into an object that basically will be kind of self-destructive to the extent that that is almost the way human beings are in themselves. We're always wanting to be better than, or feeling like we're not equal to what more can I do? And that particular type of statement is what more can I be? How much more can I be? Instead of just accepting ourselves where we're at. And he didn't accept his work being done. He had to do more. And that, to me, basically, even if you were using the religious context that's there, that is basically, when you look at the story of Adam and Eve and how they were tempted to do something, what that devil did, if you're calling him a devil, or a serpent did, was made them feel that they were less than, not equal to. And that basic spirit has happened with probably a lot of indigenous people and even other people, that other people are looked at as they're less than, they're not equal to. And that basically, the stinging that's involved in that particular, the mosquito that carries sickness can cause other people to be sick, which really spreads. So that's, for us, when you really begin to look at the word of that, taka, and taka, they had that's my grandfather's story. Paul Marks, when he gets here, but that belongs to the Sukahadi story. That was told by Robert Zuroff, is that right? But that story belongs to Sukahadi. They have the mosquito mask. If you want to see it, you can go on the internet and type mosquito thing and you'll see the mask. And my grandfather had that. James Juneau had that mosquito. That's good. Thank you for sharing my grandpa's story. I think that's where people would respond to thank you for sharing my grandfather's story.
Maybe one more comment and then I'm seeing we're almost out of time.
Also, Shada is an honorable male's name that's passed on to the basket beaver, Deshitan.
So what I've noticed that correlates with this in most, basically, creation stories. I mean, this is the creation of the mosquito, and also if you look at the creation of Adam and Eve, and what they have in common, the same with even other creation stories, like how the fog woman how they can create a salmon, is that it's always the result of somebody's poor decision that is made, and it's something that is continuously repetitive after that. It's there to remind you. The mosquitoes will always be here to remind us, being cast out of paradise and Adam and Eve, always remind us that we could have this. So I think in a lot of creation stories, it's always based off of a bad decision that's made either hastily or full of emotion before looking at it. And so that's what I got out of what you're talking there.
Yes, thank you. This question of decisions, as David also was talking about so eloquently just now, seems, and this sense of, what feelings do we have that then bring this about? That seems to me so complex, and actually where, many of these stories, which, I would say are some of the, humanity's great myths, and I use that word advisedly. That's a word that some people don't like, but I use it in a sense, as the kind of most deeply respectful sense, stories that tell us about the nature of the universe, or that, say something about how the world fits together. One of the key things that's so important is, why do we make those decisions, and what happens, what forces are acting upon us that make those decisions suddenly come about, that are catastrophic or that bring pain. And I think one thing that's definitely the case is this feeling of being less than. Another thing that comes about is that feeling of self-consciousness. This is something also that many people have seen in the Adam and Eve story, that, right, so important in the Adam and Eve story is the moment when they realize they're naked, right? So it's like there is this thing where suddenly you see yourself from the outside and you begin to panic because you think, well, what is it that others see of me? How am I being looked at? Not, I'm no longer judging myself by way of the actions that I'm engaged with. I'm now judging myself as I imagine myself to be seen from the outside. And there might be something of that in this story too, when instead of just saying, okay, I've killed the cannibal, now I'm safe, he says, what can I do more to the cannibal, right? Like there's this thought of stepping outside of himself and being like, it's no longer a question of what do I need to survive? What do I need to make it through this situation? Now it's, how do I inflict more pain on this body? I mean, how do I dramatize this? And so one thing that is often described in these stories is that psychological process of how do we lose ourselves in such a way that then leads to these actions, these very dangerous and debilitating actions.
Find that if you were to, have somebody walk in the room that's from Arizona, wherever, and they're listening to this story, and when the story opens, you say, I'm going to tell you how you got your name, and then you also say the name means around a mountain, and then the story has no reference to a mountain whatsoever. It's about an interior, it's about a big lake, it's about mosquitoes, and you might leave the person going, wow, what a great story, what did that have to do with the mountain?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I mean, would you like to?
This man that tells the story where he says the Lord above created the world. This man was I believe, a Presbyterian minister. But he also said something in another story where he said, they told us that we were of the devil. And then he said something that the devil was really good to us. It gave us all the different kinds of food, because they were referring to Raven, I believe, when they were talking about being the devil. So the devil and the Lord in the translations up here are basically referencing to me, the man's religious beliefs and so forth and so on. And I don't have any problem with that. It's just that it can misrepresent information. And so I just say that as a caution. So
I think there are two very important things in these last two comments. And one important thing about oral literature is that it is changing and moving and living, and often brings together different traditions. And so someone who is deeply schooled in Tlingit in the Tlingit tradition, but is also a Christian, is going to build a kind of synthesis in some cases in his stories. And then when it comes to the question of Shada around the mountain, and there's no mention of the mountains, I'm so glad you brought that up. There, in fact, there is another version of this story that Shada told, in which he folds this into a much longer story about the Deshitan migration. And in that story, he talks about, in fact, where the name comes from, which is that at a later moment, people, right after this story, people moved to near a mountain and they were camping around a mountain. But a great thing to point out in a classroom and just in general is to say, this is kind of what oral literature is like. It's so spontaneous and it's rich in variation and improvisation, and sometimes the story starts in one place and it kind of ends in another and doesn't quite wrap up loose ends. And this is not a weakness of oral literature. This is one of its great strengths, that it can be full of this kind of in-the-moment energy. And so the Shadach story, the fact of the name, is something that you can use to sort of point that out. But thank you for bringing that up. Thank you.
The thing about Arizona, I mean, Tlingit language is so beautiful in the sense that it does give you place. And so honestly, where is the interior? It's around the mountains. So if you have someone look at a map, it tells you a lot about migration and place and being and relation to that other place. So there are so many different levels, but thank you.
Thank you very much.